Hello, everybody. Warm welcome from Cambridge and across different time zones. We are all in. After a short break, let me welcome you in our Caucasus series on regional development and prospects of cooperation. Like I bring up that every time in every event, what we are kind of hoping to get with the series is to get a combination of practitioners and policymakers as well as academics, and we want to bring up the issue of what can be done for the prospects of regional cooperation rather than what can't be done, as is often discussed from multiple perspectives ranging from political dialogue through economic connectivity. And we are indeed very lucky to have Dr. Philip Gamaghelyan today, who will be talking from the perspective of community engagement. Let me just give you a brief introduction to our speaker and the chairperson, Dr. Saxena. So Dr. Philip Gamaghelyan, he is now an assistant professor at the Joan Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego. He's teaching conflict analysis and resolution, mediation, politics of memory, program design, monitoring, and evaluation. He's author of Conflict Resolution Beyond the International Relations Paradigm, Evolving Designs as a Transformative Peace Practice in Nagorno-Karabakh and Syria, published 2016. He is not only scholar, but also scholar practitioner. He co-founded Imagine Center for Conflict Transformation. That's actually how I first got to know of him, through the Imagine Center. And he's also managing editor of Caucasus edition Journal of Conflict Transformation. He is working across different regions, post-Soviet space, Turkey, Syria, and other conflict regions. And he is engaging with policymakers, journalists, educators, social scientists, and other discourse-creating professionals. His other research focuses on politics of memory in conflict contexts and on critical reevaluation and design of conflict resolution interventions. Our chair today is Dr. Siddharth Saxena. He is a principal research associate in Cavendish Lab at the University of Cambridge, also co-investigator in the GCRF Compass project, and a lecturer at the Center of Development Studies and director of Cambridge Central Asia Forum. So let me just thank you again all for coming, and let me pass the floor to Dr. Saxena first. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakub. To start with, the only thing I have to say is to welcome Philip, who has kindly agreed, despite the difference in time zone and all the other things he has to do in his daily work, to make time for us, because we think it's a very valuable exercise. First of all, about learning. This is our first, most important motivation. That part of our Central Asia and Caucasus teaching and research in Cambridge. We like to learn about different aspects from different points of views, and when people give time to do that, to help with, and many of our students are attending, and our broader student set, not just from Cambridge, but our overall program, Compass, which was mentioned, which worked with Central Asia and Caucasus as well as Belarus. So within this framework, one of the only thing that I like to say at this stage is that we like to think of Caucasus region and Central Asia region as living geographies, not as boundaried nation states, and which are finding ways to kind of progress their cause in terms of economics, politics, society, and other aspects, and we want this series to kind of underpin learning and thinking about that broader region, its connectivity, its reality, not just in terms of countries. However, this is up for debate, and we would like to open the discussion with your opening comments. Philip, please.
Thank you, Jakub. Thank you, Dr. Saxena, for the introduction and for the invitation. So we are in 2021, and this is the year that marks the 30th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union and independence of all the states in South Caucasus and Central Asia and elsewhere in the former Soviet space. And unfortunately, and tragically, that also means it's the 30th anniversary since a number of violent conflicts had started in many of these regions, particularly in the South Caucasus, and none of them has been solved to date. And unfortunately, I'll be rather pessimistic, I think, in my assessment of where we are and what's possible as we hit this 30th anniversary. Now, what I'll say, probably some early parts will be well known to the audience who is present live with us, but since I know that the talk will be going also be posted publicly, I'll probably take a bit of a step back and give some context to my talk. And then later in the discussion, hopefully we can move towards more advanced topics and what we can think about where we can go from here. So now this conflict, and I will be focusing more on Nagorno-Karabakh than the conflicts between Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. They are oftentimes analyzed from geopolitical or economic perspective, and for a good reason. But since I'm asked today to talk about the intersocietal relations and possibilities for community engagement, I intend to take a different lens and to look at it from the perspective of the nationalism studies. And for that, I'll go back a little bit and say that these conflicts, although oftentimes seen as ancient and old, are not really that old. And specifically the Armenian-Azerbaijani, any form of violence is first recorded in 1905 in the late years of the Russian Empire, followed by a war in 1918, in the short period when Armenia and Azerbaijan were independent. And that, of course, is very important for today's relationship. But not less important, I'd say, is the attempt of the Soviet Union to solve these conflicts, and specifically the policies of nationalities of the early Soviet years, which was, to quote Terry Martin and Ronald Sunny, was an affirmative action and a very progressive policy at the time. The intention of which was, in one hand, to solve these conflicts, and on the other, to suppress the imperialist Russian nationalism, which they saw as suppressing the smaller ethnic groups, and in turn give a chance to emancipate for the ethnic groups that have been suppressed and discriminated in the past by Russian, again, imperial nationalism, elevating these groups to a status of a nation, giving them a territory where they can self-govern, and that gave them also a degree of political autonomy and a quite large degree of cultural autonomy, a chance to create national academies of sciences, namely including national historiography, national education systems, and so on. So essentially, the Russian nationalism, as imperial nationalism, was being suppressed, while the
Philip, you've been muted somehow. Something went wrong.
Yeah, I don't know whether I was cut off, but I was saying that the policy effectively was to suppress the imperial nationalism with an idea to emancipate the smaller ethnic groups and giving them a status of a nation. So being a progressive idea on its own, it of course had also serious challenges of implementation. Some of which were that there were many more groups around that there was territory to go by. And the second was that the ethnic groups were not territorially segregated. So it wasn't like any territory where only Armenians or only Azerbaijanis or only Georgians and so on lived. And most of them were cohabiting in the same territory. So one particular territory was assigned, let's say, to a particular nation, say Armenians or Azerbaijanis, and carried their name and gave a chance to this particular ethnic group develop their essentially nation in ethnic terms. In this territory, other groups living in that territory acquired a second-class citizen status, and they effectively were institutionally discriminated. The second level of discrimination had to do with the hierarchy of ethnicities and nations, the way they were called, created, which is 15 eventually of these groups received a status of the highest status of self-governance, the Soviet Socialist Republic status, that were seen as constituting members of the Soviet Union and eventually became the independent states accepted by the international community. Some others, specifically Abkhazians and Ossetians in Georgia, Armenians in Azerbaijan, and Chechens in Russia, and so on, number of others, received the status of a nation that were granted autonomy within one of these 15 higher status republics. Further number of nations, ethnic groups received the name of a nation, but no territory assigned to them. That included Greeks, Kurds, and others. And a further number did not receive a designation and were with time assimilated into one of those that had effectively an institutional status. So over 70 years, this again created very institutionalized discrimination where some nations or ethnic groups had a dominant place in a particular territory over others and created grievances effectively on a basis of ethnic political nationalism that has been again cultivated from the early years of the Soviet Union. So when Soviet Union was collapsing, is not an accident, then that all the violent conflicts in 1990s took place between an ethnic autonomy and its former Soviet time parent state. In Caucasus, these were of course Abkhazians and Ossetians versus Georgia, and in Azerbaijan, these Armenians of Karabakh versus Azerbaijan. And the ideological basis for this was the ethnic nationalism, again in the style that was a carryover from this ethnic institution building in the Soviet Union. So we had the conflicts in the 90s, pretty violent conflicts, again, based in ethnic nationalism. By mid-90s, however, we shifted to a different territory. The conflicts all ended in a ceasefire. None of them was solved. However, the active violence was contained. And the nationalism changed colors, so it became softer. It went from rather very ethnic primordialist understood version of it in early 90s to a civic understanding of more inclusive based on a citizenship form of nationalism. And that switch happened in big part because the political atmosphere worldwide was very conducive to that. That was the time known, famously proclaimed by Fukuyama as the end of history, where it was axiomatically accepted pretty much by everyone, including in South Caucasus and everywhere worldwide, that the liberal democracy was the culmination of human development in political sense, that one way or another we are all moving towards liberal democracy with everything that comes with it, including the provisions of strong human rights and minority rights. And that once we all reach the stage of a liberal democracy, the conflicts will be meaningless, or at least they will not be violent. If they even exist, they will be managed peacefully, constructively, such as other conflicts in existing liberal democracies, for example, Quebec nationalism being present, and yet is managed peacefully, of course, and without any violence. So that was the assumption that all the policymakers and civil societies and academics and so on were working from, that there is this end goal, and once we reach it, the democratic peace hypothesis will help us all live peacefully, happily ever after. 20 years later, a little more than 20 years later, perhaps now, we are in a very different place, and unfortunately, we can acknowledge that the liberal peace did not win, not only in the South Caucasus, but it was very far from end of history. It's very hotly contested in all the established liberal democracies. It's even more contested in a region such as South Caucasus that never got to that place in the first place. And we have a return with vengeance of ethno-nationalism, and oftentimes crossing into its fascist variation and a very extreme version of ethno-nationalism. Why I say fascist variation? Because it's now very commonly understood to be, the ethnicity is understood to be about blood and genes in a very kind of basic primordialist sense. And as a consequence, the conflicts are seen to be kind of about genetic incompatibility. This was a phrase exactly like this used by one of the former Armenian presidents, that Armenians and Azerbaijanis have genetic incompatibility. So it's seen as a very existential struggle between kind of incompatible blood types. And that's a very hard place to work from when we are talking about integration and cooperation and community relationship, where this is really a very commonly accepted version of nationalism. Now, why we got there? One, in a global sense, I already mentioned that there was backslide of the idea of liberal democracy as the eventual destination for everybody, and hard turn towards authoritarianism in many of the countries in this region, and the rest never really fully making the transition towards liberal democracy. But in a smaller sense, or more specific to the region sense, the liberal peace approach never worked. I'd argue, and I mentioned this in a talk recently somewhere else as well, not because it was attempted and failed, but because it was never attempted. So we talked about peace building, and what we had were only official negotiations, which were serious, again, only in this short period in mid to late 1990s, where the assumption was we were all moving towards liberal democracy. Since then, they were either imitation of negotiations, or at best, they were negotiations to contain new violence, but they were not really attempts to solve the conflict in any serious sense. And that applies to Karabakh as much as to South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And on the other hand, on a non-official track, you had only small, very small scale civil NGO collaborations. And that's it. And yet, if you look into any kind of academic definition of liberal peace, it's a much more extensive and expensive and comprehensive approach, right? It assumes, well, first of all, movement towards democratization, which absolutely faltered. It assumes introduction of human rights, specifically minority rights, and we have them only in name in this region. It's basically impossible to talk about rights of Armenians in Azerbaijan or rights of Azerbaijanis in Armenia. It's even the conversation itself is a non-starter. It assumes collaboration through international institutions such as UN or OSCE, but they were only used to counter each other, never for cooperation. Diplomatic relations were never established. Liberal peace assumes economic integration, yet what was happening is the exact opposite. There was complete mutual isolation economically, and even small attempts on the societal level to create some informal markets for exchange of merchandise. There was one in Sadakhlo in the border in Georgia, in the border of Armenia and Azerbaijan. There was another one in Georgia, South Ossetia contact line, another one in Georgia, Abkhazia contact line. All of them, even these small attempts to have some form of human interaction, were shut down in around 2005. By the Saakashvili government with support of the Armenian and Azerbaijani governments. So there was supposed to be transitional justice if we were serious about liberal peace building, because there were massive amounts of war crimes that took place in 1990s. There was no transitional justice even discussed. I don't even think that's a term well known to either policymakers or even academics in this region. So there was massive amount of displacement, and nothing at all has been done to restitute the rights of those who were displaced or otherwise suffered from the war. So essentially nothing from whatever we assume to be liberal peace. It was present in name, but none of these provisions were seriously considered, let alone implemented, again, apart from very small scale NGO level collaborations, which were assumed to be that this is liberal peace, and this, again, 2-3 NGOs were expected somehow to deliver peace, when really everything else was working in opposite direction. So I am rather pessimistic today, and normally if you ask those who know me, I've been rather one of the most optimistic voices throughout this past 15 years or so, talking about the need for cooperation, about what's possible. At this point, I'm rather pessimistic because we arrived, again, institutionally, we are not in a good place. The there is no big picture institutional framework for a solution. If that was liberal democracy in 1990s, that is not anymore the case. This is not where the region is moving, neither the world. And there is no kind of any extensive provisions for peace building in place, while the nationalism moved from its short period of civic version in 1990s towards a very ethnic, exclusivist and almost fascist version of understanding of it, again, pretty much across the board, and is just as visible in more democratic places like Georgia or Ukraine as in less democratic parts of the former Soviet space. And unfortunately, that's supported, this more pessimistic assessment of mine is supported by post-war developments in the region, where looking into Armenia, it's right now practically impossible to talk about collaboration. It's, to a degree might be understandable. The country just lost a war. There has been massive amount of lives lost, and a country is in mourning. But that, coupled with this understanding of kind of ethnic, genetic blood enmity with Azerbaijan, makes it very hard to talk about any possibility of kind of solving the conflict in the longer run, because it's simply seen as an existential struggle. Now, looking into Azerbaijan, that probably is the country right now that, since they won the war, is in a better position to extend a hand. And you get some mixed messaging. Yeah, so there are some calls for economic collaboration, for example, being heard. But that is coupled again into this play, including by very high level officials, into this ethnic incompatibility idea. So two major recent developments is one that Azerbaijan still holds a pretty big number, up to 200 or so apparently, prisoners of war that they are refusing to hand back with a rhetorical device of not calling them prisoners of war. And that is, well, first of all, a huge humanitarian problem on its own, but also creates a very serious sense of enmity in Armenia, where there are reports coming from Human Rights Watch and other organizations that these people are held and potentially tortured. Another example was like 2 or 3 days ago only, the president of Azerbaijan cut the ribbon for alley of trophies, something to that extent, or museum of trophies in Baku that presents not only trophies in a sense that of hardware, such as tanks captured from Armenian side, but also hundreds of helmets of Armenians recently killed in a war. And again, the war is recent, the parents are still in mourning, so seeing these pictures is not really helping. And also some wax figures of the dehumanizing Armenians, kind of Armenians being not tortured but killed and wounded in a war. So all of this really creates a very harsh relationship where this sense of ethnic enmity only grows day by day. Not to end on a pessimistic note only, the questions you asked me, I'll just read 1 or 2 of them to also answer, was what are the areas where regional cooperation is possible on the community level, and which support mechanisms have proven to be effective. And I would want to reframe this question based on what I said until now, because I believe the problem was that we as an international community and the civil society were looking to these small opportunities, places for opening, where we can do something. And specifically for the last couple of decades, it was the NGO collaboration, and this is where all the investments really went into. But that was great because it kept some connections going, but it didn't do anything for the big picture. So my strong recommendation to everyone involved will be to really work on putting together a comprehensive peace process, because right now that NGO collaboration seem to be, as in one aspect, seem to be replaced by other, let's open up railroads and get some economic collaboration going. And that's great on its own, but this will not itself solve issues similar to NGOs formerly not solving anything, because, well, you have this very kind of everything else moving in a direction of a new cycle of violence, and this very extreme version of ethnic animosity. the physical connection or rails going through one another are simply an excuse for more violence toward each other. They are not necessarily yet a step towards any kind of a solution. So my final thought here is that we do need to put in place a serious, comprehensive peace process that involves resolving immediate humanitarian issues, such as handover of the prisoners of war, and from the Armenian side, collaboration on demining. That's another problem that the region faces. Followed by establishment of diplomatic relations. Yes, there's a more serious approach to negotiations, economic interrelations, not only through railroad, but that go through the opening of the border and allowing that to happen on a grassroots level, especially in the border regions where people could benefit a lot from having access to the other side. But followed by mechanisms such as transitional justice that will help address war crimes, both of the first war and the second war. Not less importantly, focus on the restitutions to the massive amount of displaced populations and others who suffered from these wars. Because what's happening right now is the countries are suing each other in the International Criminal Court or the European Court of Human Rights. And sure, that's one way of handling it, but this will take forever. We'll probably get results as we know this courts work very, very slowly to a very small number of people. It's not likely to result in anything that can help with restitutions to hundreds of thousands of people who suffered. And kind of the second part of transitional justice is the memory work. And this is connected to things such as the museum I just mentioned. To any peace process, comprehensive peace process should focus and think about what are the museums, how are they really built, how they promote reconciliation as opposed to further violence. Same applies to education, which currently promotes hatred towards each other, and so on. And final thought is that we could also think about some demilitarized zones and some small areas of called peace zones also that are practices used in some other violent conflicts where Armenians and Azerbaijanis can start coexisting together, not in bulk, but in a small, more incremental steps. So I will stop here and wait for your questions and thoughts.
Thank you, Philip. Engaging with both difficult and a painful topic, and we have tried to, in many ways, take time to talk about it, and of course, it's never time enough to, but we have to start the conversation at some place, and I'm glad that we have today. To start with, we had certain, as you said, certain leading questions in a sense, and like to ask Jakub to kind of launch in with that, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion and then open up to the floor afterwards. Jakub.
Let me start by thanking Philip for a very interesting talk, and partially it was interesting because it's the nationalist policies are part of my PhD research, so it's interesting for me as well in this regard. But it was, I think, for everybody good to see kind of the historical development perspective, and also that the conflict has not always been there. It's an I think important thing to realize. Also, the discussion on the kind of liberal peace, or kind of I mean, I think after 30 years, I come from Central Europe. We realize the kind of it's not only about the democracy, the kind of the end of history, but also from the neoliberal economic transformation perspective. I think the time has simply moved on, but that let's put that aside. So you have touched upon the kind of the first question, the main areas in which regional cooperation at the community level could be, I mean, is most needed and would be feasible. Let me move on to the second one straight away, because it's kind of very much linked to that. And what would be the support mechanisms, I mean, that have proven as effective in the past, and which ones are needed and could be there? and could prove effective. Thank you.
Mhm. Thank you. So what's been, again, the only period of time, looking back for 30 years, that I think there was any serious movement towards resolution, and I think it's not an accident that it was in parallel happening in both Karabakh case and in Georgia, South Ossetia, but less so in Georgia, Abkhazia. But Georgia, South Ossetia, but it also was possible conflict brewing at the time between Georgia and Algeria, which also got handled in this period, where late 1990s and a little bit very early 2000s, which again was the period from which we certainly have moved on, in terms of movement towards liberal democracy all around the world. But it's important in a different way conceptually too, because it wasn't a particular aspect that was dealt with. There was a ground vision of this is where we're going, right? So there is this liberal democracy, human rights, minority rights, and that's the solution. So that bigger framework created a vision towards which everybody was moving, and also created a kind of very clear roadmap for international actors, for example, to support a peace process. Right, so it has been seen as possible locally, and it's been seen as what to be supported internationally. So since then, again, I don't think anything has been effective at all. We can talk about effectiveness of a particular small initiative or a particular an aspect, but none of that has been effective in terms of moving the region towards peace. If anything, very consistently, the region has been, particularly Armenia and Azerbaijan, very consistently we're moving towards war. So in that global sense, in a bigger picture sense, nothing since 1990s, I believe, was effective. So considering that, in my view, the main investment now should be into the development, put into the development of that bigger picture, as in what is that peace will look like, right? So what is these countries can look like, and then build everything on that. Because again, right now we are, as I said, jumping from one civil society collaboration to let's open railroads conversation. Yeah, no problem with that on its own from my side, but I don't think it will solve anything, right? So yes, it might help maybe Russia and Turkey to transport goods easier between themselves, but that's it. So there is maybe some, it will work for interconnectivity globally, but hardly will help with the solutions locally. This is where I feel like the big need to have this bigger picture, and more comprehensive peace process put in place, which never was done. Again, with broader range of economic interrelations, but with also very strong emphasis on transitional justice and reforms in things such as education and memory politics. I'm sorry, I didn't talk about feasibility of that, but I think for me that's secondary, because essentially, if you talk about feasibility, then very easily we will go to what you asked not to do. I agree with. We will talk about what's not possible. But partially things are not possible because we don't have a vision necessarily. We don't have this bigger picture sense of where we are going. So every step is seen as a loss or a compromise. None of that is seen as, okay, we might be contributing something towards some form of a better future for ourselves. That is missing.
Thank you. Yeah, what comes through, one of the things which I thought I would get your views on. So, unpacking something. So the phrase that we use about liberal democracy and it's interconnected with liberal peace and so on. My feeling more is that not that we have moved on or moved back or moved forward. Simply, it has changed. The fact that that particular label became hijacked to mean an agenda for certain particular global powers to make certain other countries behave in a particular way. And of course, this criticism is not new. This comes up, but at the ground level, what it means is that the stakeholdership. So when we say liberal democracy, we are assuming within that discussion that the people are the biggest stakeholders, and if they have a voice, then it will overcome the collective good of those within the country and then within the region overall. And but that particular assumption that or operational principle that we work with is something which has got distorted as we go along. And so keeping that in mind, I wanted to ask you a very specific question, that if we were to just look at Armenia initially and think through that, what are the challenges within Armenia regarding thinking and believing that their place is within the region of Caucasus, I mean, of course, in the global community, but immediate neighborhood is something that they can live without, or they must live with, or they have to live with. That that notion of being in a that small so-called corridor, that how one starts to think, which is in between bigger powers. All of those phrases that are used to describe a particular place, they tend to seep down into the psychology of how communities start to behave. And would you say that are we at a stage in the region, but particularly in Armenia, where such things would be meaningful to talk about, or they're too abstract?
Well, talking about Armenia specifically, it's in a major crisis right now, and effectively, it's type of a crisis that Azerbaijan and Georgia had early in the 90s in a way, and probably all of that was connected in their case as well, or partially at least, to the loss of the wars at the time. So Armenia never, in modern times, right, in post-Soviet years, did not have a loss of a war, so it never dealt with a crisis like the one it's encountering now. And it's a major crisis, a very visibly political one, where the government, on the one hand, lost legitimacy because, yeah, it lost the war. At the same time, there is no political opposition, that all the political opposition are the former governments who in turn previously had lost their own legitimacy. So effectively, we are, Armenia is in a place where you have a contest of the least popular, who is less illegitimate. And that's one type of a crisis that Armenia is dealing with, and it's very hard to see how it can come out of it. It probably cannot in any kind of near future, because the elections might happen in June, early elections, but they will probably bring at least again whoever is least unpopular, as opposed to any group that will be come up with a vision and have any serious legitimacy. That's political end of it, but Armenia is also dealing then with a very major trauma, which didn't have in modern history, well, since, of course, the genocide of 1915, but not in post-Soviet years. And that is really what drives all the conversations, is the trauma of the war, is what happened during the war, people that died, everybody knows somebody who died, and a very close attention to what Azerbaijan is doing. And every message, this mixed messaging about cooperation, is either not heard, or if it's heard very much in context of this other problematic messaging that I was mentioning, of President Aliyev potentially consistently talking about Zangezur and Yerevan being Azerbaijani lands. He might follow up with a sentence saying, oh, but we don't have territorial claims. But that second sentence is not necessarily heard. The first one is what's being transmitted all over social media and media in Armenia. So even economic cooperation is seen from the perspective of Azerbaijan now claiming Yerevan and Zangezur, effectively the Armenia itself. Yeah, and just having lost the war, it is seen as a direct existential threat. So it's, there is no any sense of thinking about this as a region. All the conversations seem to be centered around how we survive in the face of this right now stronger enemy that seems keen on destroying us. This is pretty much the context of the conversation. Any kind of bigger picture issues of collaboration, region, are very, very secondary, and to an extent I've never seen. In these 30 years, it was never a big problem to talk about collaboration or bigger picture, how we move forward in Armenia, because again, as the side that won the war in the 90s, in a way there was less pressure to have that conversation compared to, for example, Azerbaijan in the past. So the tables have turned here in a sense. It's becoming very, very hard to have any kind of a visionary conversation or any kind of constructive conversation. Again, because it is the wall of we are under existential threat. This is why I see it's so important to engage in something like transitional justice, where the threat perception can be removed and attitudes towards each other can be changed, after which we can think about rebuilding this South Caucasus as a region.
If I may just continue asking a couple more questions, not scripted earlier, but coming out of the discussion that you're bringing, because since you have worked and engaged with all across all sides of the border, and we also had the privilege of listening to in this series our Azeri and Georgian friends talk about their intentions on cooperation and so on. So one almost how to say a cheeky question would be that what would you think that the feeling around the last war when Armenian side had a victorious sort of experience, would you say that the feeling among the populace, would that in some way reflect what is happening in Azerbaijan today, or are they quite distinct from each other? This is a question I'm not sure can be easily answered, but it's just a curiosity driven thing since you have been working. And a related question is the other side, not only since we're discussing the region as a whole, so not talking so much only about Azerbaijan and Armenia, but very often Georgia speaks of how well it goes along with both of its neighbors. But as soon as we analyze as academics the real sort of actually tangible parts of that cooperation, we see not intensity or volumes not to be that large, whether it's economic, political, or any other kind, other than the fact that there are groups of both countries end up being in Georgia and they have community level engagement. But nevertheless, how would you rate the actual relationship between Georgia and Armenia rather than Armenia and Azerbaijan only? Two distinct questions, but in my mind they're connected a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, so the first one, I see quite a number of Azerbaijanis in the conversation, so it would be good to hear maybe from Leila or others on that as well. My take will be that Armenia made a major mistake in taking too far, or making too much out of the military victory in 1990s. Yes, Armenia won the battle, in 1990s, but their conflict did not end there. There was, of course, a future life to be had, and Armenia went way too far. Consecutive government went way too far in trying to hold on to everything that they were able to conquer at the time militarily, and not attempting to compromise, and not really extending the hand to Azerbaijan, specifically to Azerbaijanis who were displaced from these regions, and creating a very massive sense of enmity from Azerbaijanis, having hundreds of thousands of displaced, having territories that were not even formally contested by Armenia, not being seriously considered to be returned, and so on. So all of this kind of made the revanche feelings almost inevitable, and it was only a matter of time before the tables would turn or war would happen. The outcome perhaps was a different question, as in how it would be. Now we know the answer to that question. So Azerbaijan unfortunately seems to be going in the same direction, and maybe even in a bigger steps, as in very quickly and immediately trying to capitalize on the victory in a war a bit too much, and trying to dominate Armenia, which now creates the opposite. Essentially, it creates similar type of feelings in Armenia that they were at the time created in Azerbaijan. And yes, Armenia right now is absolutely in opposition to think about the revanche, but so wasn't Azerbaijan in 1994. Right, so it was at the time a failed state that had just came out of civil war. In addition to the loss of the war, completely collapsed economy. It took 30 years, but here we are in a very different place. So yes, Armenia doesn't have oil, so it's not necessarily the same blueprint that it can follow. Having said that, keeping a very violent conflict alive especially the one that has been regionalized right now, that brought in other actors, can really definitely will have very unpredictable consequences. Not only for Armenia, who might try to get some form of revenge, but also inevitably for Azerbaijan, especially once other actors are drawn into the fighting, and that is already happening. So in this sense, I do hope that Azerbaijan, I think Azerbaijani authorities, let's say the current or future, are wiser than the Armenian authorities of the time, and don't overdo, essentially don't make too much of this victory thinking into the bigger picture, the necessity to find a way to coexist with Armenians in Karabakh, but also Armenians in Armenia. Yet I don't see necessarily that movement, but or at least the mixed messaging seems to be tilted in favor of trying to dominate and humiliate Armenians as opposed to extend the hand. Or at least that's how it seems from the Armenian side, and that has to change if there is a move towards some kind of a solution. Now to Georgia and Armenia. Yeah, it's a long conversation on its own. It's like a pretty complicated relationship on its own. But not to go too far, because there again we can discuss history and economics and what else. But one important factor is this different trajectories with Georgia moving more towards European integration, and Armenia, especially after this war, much more firmly moving in Eurasian Union direction, both militarily but also economically and so on. So that does create a further kind of split that the two are going in different directions. Although theoretically there has been a lot of conversations of Armenia, for example, being part of both European integration process and the Eurasian integration process could act as a bridge potentially, right? So it can, both for Georgia and Russia and the West and so on, try to be the hub through which integration or economic cooperation happens. But that's more aspirational right now. That's not really in practice. The second area of serious challenge is that ethno-nationalism, a very extreme version of it that I was mentioning. And there the enmity in all of these countries goes all around. So yes, Azerbaijanis and Turks are the primary enemy in the list of enemies of Armenia, but pretty much there is this very a sense of very some ethnic uniqueness, some chosen nation type of a sense that exists in Armenia and Georgia as well, that are positioning themselves, they are seeing in somehow opposition to everybody else, and since the others are Christians also not supportive of us, then by that they are traitors. So there is this sense of feeling that exists. And unfortunately it's mutual too, because in Georgia, I actually tried to attempt to live there at some point, and I love Georgia. My family is from Georgia. I'm ethnically Armenian. But once I tried to live there, I realized how much ethnic stereotyping exists in Georgia towards Armenians as well, and vice versa, in Armenia towards Georgians. So unfortunately, you have this ethno-nationalism translates also into rather negative attitudes towards even those neighbors that you don't have a violent conflict with. So there is a lot of work to be done in this direction as well. It's not a conflict, but it's not necessarily cordial relationship either.
We're coming from India, living in UK. Ethno-nationalism is, all around, in full force. So not to continue hogging, Philip, Jakub, would you have a last point, or shall we open up to the public and people can use the raise hand function or write their comments and we'll read it for you, or whichever way people like.
We can open up the questions, and
Sure.
I might come back with my own.
I know I have too many, but and Philip's answering them so lucidly, so I have to contain. Okay, so then let's invite Callie Berman, who's a PhD student here in Cambridge as well, Jakub's batchmate.
Sorry, I'm just getting my video started if I can. There it is. Sorry. Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for a really comprehensive discussion. That was really, really insightful. So my familiarity with the region isn't so much from the ethnic or conflict resolution perspective, so forgive me for maybe more of a naive question, but I'm interested. It seems like based on this last uprising, the conflict in last year, that the role of social media is something that is often, it's implicitly understood in terms of its significance, but it's not really incorporated into the conflict resolution analyses that, or given equal weight when we talk about memory making, because from my impression, it seems like how things were discussed, that the memory making is happening almost more so within social media platforms rather than museum exhibits, and or that's more translated publicly and internationally, but what's really happening in terms of memory making is happening much more on social media. So was just wondering if, you know, based on your more close most contact with conflict resolution strategies, how much have they sort of turned to or looked to the role of social media in these things and the process of memory making?
Thank you. I'm trying to think how to answer this shortly, because I happen to teach a whole course on social media right now. So it's two-sentence version is difficult, yeah, a bit. But I mean, short answer for me will be that it's not too different from everything else. So I don't see a very big difference between a discourse that's in the museums that we just mentioned and in social media. It's very similar. So overall, the discourse is the ethno-nationalist discourse is very well consolidated, and is just being reproduced either in the history classroom or in a museum or in social media. Pretty much recycling of the same conversation over and over and over again. It's just some places it's reproduced more diplomatically, in other places more violently, but otherwise the narratives are very well consolidated. And again, they have this carryover from the Soviet time understanding of ethnicity and identity, which was based in this studies of genetics, somehow, at least towards the final years, and that's very much carried over along with a sense of everybody being an ancient nation that is fighting for survival. So these narratives are, again, not that different in social media as they are in kind of hard world. Having said that, the other part of the equation is, of course, social media does change a conversation in a bigger sense, that it's the way communication functions. For example, in more the countries that were democratizing, that played a major role, particularly in Armenia recently. So the revolution of 2018 was very much led or facilitated, let's say, by Facebook. So all the organization, mobilization happened through Facebook. So in that sense, it broke through the authoritarianism and then continued on Facebook. So the whole governance is really a Facebook governance. Not they probably are more familiar with Trump's tweet governance, right, in the US. So something very similar is happening in Armenia, where the prime minister governs pretty much in direct communication through Facebook, in that case, not Twitter. And a lot of policy is based on how many likes which comment can gather, right? So there is this kind of Facebook popularity chase where people have direct input, and yet because the discourse is nationalistic, the prime minister himself, who prior to coming to power wasn't known for nationalism at all. If anything, the expectation was he will be more kind of pro-peace because he was speaking in that direction. Seeing that the ethno-nationalist discourse is popular, he very quickly shifted into kind of garner more popularity or retain his popularity. He started reproducing social media narratives, which in turn were kind of previous authorities promoted official narratives, right? So it changes communication. It doesn't necessarily change the discourse, at least in no form in a positive way. Again, in part because, as I mentioned, there is no simply peace process in any comprehensive sense put in place, which, yes, should also have a social media strategy where it exists, but it doesn't. There has not been any messaging from any level, neither from governments nor from civil society in any kind of comprehensive sense, not from academia, towards building anything but an image of the enemy. Yeah, so at this point, that's simply another platform where the enmity is reproduced.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have Project T as next person.
Hello. Thank you so much for the talk, and the question and answers are really fascinating. My question was, how do you think that the diasporic community in some way contributes to the continuation of negative feelings and social tensions and the conflict? They have their own vested interest in some of this to continue. Does that have any impact, in your opinion?
It does, certainly. The short answer is yes, it does. Overall, if you look into conflict literature, countries that have major diaspora, particularly in the West, tend to have longer protracted conflicts because they have kind of this unlimited resource of support and lobbying, but also kind of potentially a group of ethnics who don't suffer from the conflict, so they can continue investing in it without carrying any consequences of a conflict. So that's kind of well-known part of conflict literature, and certainly that plays a role. Yeah, so there is an Armenian diaspora that has been supportive of Armenia. At least in terms of international public opinion, it played a role in 1990s and so on. Since then, Azerbaijan intentionally invested in building its own diaspora to counter Armenian diaspora. So all of that plays a role. Having said that, I think there is also an extent to which that role is exaggerated. And this has been my point consistently, that I see diaspora playing more of a supportive role rather than leading role. At least in the Armenian diaspora sense, you have a few organizations who are much more invested in the recognition of the Armenian genocides, themselves being, well, first of all, descendants of that story of violence, but also that's where most of the let's say fundraising drive comes from. Because this is where those who donate also are more invested in. So this Karabakh conflict is somewhat secondary, has been somewhat secondary until recently, at least for the diaspora, and they followed more the lead of the Armenian governments and just supported whatever the Armenian governments were interested. Azerbaijani diaspora is even more so dependent because, again, in an institutionalized sense, it's very directly a product of a policy which is funded by the state. It's curated and coordinated by the embassies. So in terms of organized Azerbaijani diaspora, right, it's also very much an extension of the state. It's not necessarily an actor on its own. You have individuals, such as the two people in this screen, I see myself, who are in diaspora and independent voices. So that's different. And in this sense, you have much more focus on cooperation, I would say, from the non-organized diaspora than you have from organized diaspora. But again, I see them more as followers than as leaders in this conflict.
Thank you. Any further questions from the audience? So Jakub, would you like to come in at this minute?
If we don't have any more questions from the audience, let me actually go back. I know you were quite skeptical about the prospects, and you were kind of saying that for the past decade or so, it was mostly the kind of the cooperation, as we would call it, would be going from one NGO or civil society from another. But if we go kind of more deeper into that, I mean, the Imagine Center was one of the, essentially NGO or civil society cooperation. And I recall also conversation from past, a couple of months ago, from someone in OSCE, and she was kind of thinking what would be the kind of good areas where the region could work together. The obvious one, which is becoming trendy, is the environment and climate change. So if you looked into the past NGO initiatives and just look at maybe the design, the areas where, I mean, obviously you probably know by now what has worked and what didn't, and what could maybe work in the future, even on this very, very basic level of cooperation. Thank you.
Well, about the pessimism and all, let me start there. The prospects for cooperation, yeah, they don't look good, but at the same time, I think they are simply a necessity. So having said I'm pessimistic, as in I don't think they are in a good place, but I don't see really an alternative to that. Well, there is an alternative, which is more violence down the road, or simply loss of sovereignty, probably initially by Armenia, but then by extension, I think that everything else will fall as well, as we've seen in the past, and that Georgia and Azerbaijan probably will not be too far behind if it goes in that direction. So I think until now, we've been more played, as in these countries have been, but many other post-colonial small states have been more played rather than players, and becoming players. They have been players against each other, but not much else. Again, the extent is different. Azerbaijan is probably more of a player right now than Armenia and so on. But overall, to come out as sovereign states in the long run, the cooperation is simply a necessity. That's one. So I am optimistic in a longer sense. I believe once we have serious policymakers in governments, they will not see that as a necessity. The environment is another area you mentioned that is, again, simply a necessity. It's not dealt with, though. So similar to the politics, this is another area that has to be attended, is not. And this is a serious problem that has been a problem for a long time. For example, water pollution is a very major problem in this whole region. And in part because of conflicts, because they are not cooperating, of course. They are not even signatories of the same international treaties. So they could cooperate indirectly, potentially, right? So sign the same treaty and then follow the same standards. They almost choose different treaties to sign and ratify, not to be in the same treaty with the other. So it comes to the level of essentially not even having clean water, partially because of the conflicts. There are more specific issues, such as the water dams that are in a state of potential collapse. There was one in Zonkari in South Ossetia that was fixed. Otherwise, it was, but it had to go through many steps of closed-door negotiations to even get to a point of being repaired. Otherwise, it was going to flood both South Ossetia and Georgia, right? So, but there are similar potentially problematic dam in the conflict zone in Karabakh as well. So there are these, very everyday issues. The forests have been burning. There is no cooperation. A lot of, the forest fire doesn't know the borders. A lot of times it's also intentionally burned because it's seen as the other's border forest, as if you don't breathe the same air, So there's there's mining problems everywhere and so on. So there's a lot of issues that on environment, it's like another example of why this cooperation is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, the whole region is getting destroyed, from ground up, from environment up. I still will come back to it, though. I think we need to work on a relationship before we can work on environment or economics, or at least in parallel. Because when we are seeing each other as blood enemies, it does become a very tangible problem, right? So it seems to be something all abstract, but it's not, because the Armenians have a physical fear of Azerbaijanis. When I try to invite Armenians to come into meetings, for those who have not seen Azerbaijanis in the last 30 years, the first question is, physically, we will be safe? But now I meet Azerbaijanis every month, so for me, that has not been really a question, right? But this is a very, very common question that almost every Armenian who has not been constantly in touch with Azerbaijanis, they don't ask about politics, so they ask physically, am I traveling to Georgia or Austria or wherever, am I going to be physically safe, right? So when you have this kind of a fear, how do you talk about the trees and environment and railroads, right? So that needs to be dealt with, in my view, in the first place.
Yeah, that's very reminiscent of some of the things from South Asia we've experienced. That kind of question that comes up. Okay, we have a question from Leila Alieva. Leila, you're muted.
Yes, thank you so much, Phil. It's always a great pleasure to listen to you. I particularly appreciated what you said about the Soviet policies and the Soviet flaws. And the problem, I think, is that nobody tried to delegitimize the ethnic hatred. Nobody tried to basically to deconstruct the threats, showing that what we're dealing with is not the ancient ethnic hatred, but it's the direct consequence of the flaws of the Soviet policies. So I don't even think there was an attempt to develop this civic-based identity or nationalism. I just can't recall it. And I think it was just going through, and moreover, very often from the international experts, you would hear like a mantra that they hate each other. They hate each other, and it's been there for more than 100 years. And, you know, it basically resolves all the issues. Once you say that these people hate each other, that resolves a lot of issues because it takes responsibility away from other actors. But what is interesting, I noticed that after the war, there's much greater platforms, a number of initiatives on peace resolution and peacemaking. It became really, compared to what it was before the war, which was mainly small and secret groups of, you know, NGOs who were cooperating under pressure and things like that. But now, probably partly because of the also COVID and internet as the only way, but the security have-nots, if you use the certain definitions, or peace voices, which were not heard before, they now heard. And from the marginal groups of peacemakers, now we moved to the platforms of popular political leaders or bloggers or, you know, journalists who have a huge amount. If you look at the videos of the joint projects, Armenian, Azerbaijani platforms or project, you would see it's reaching 200,000 views and predominantly positive likes and, you know, reactions. But I didn't notice that many people abroad and experts speak about that. Why do you think people just don't they just think it's not important? Or why do you think, how do you assess it? Why not many people speak about this, from my point of view, quite a powerful counter move in the societies? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I hope you're right. So this is not a temporary kind of splash of activity. So that's how I'm assessing it. And again, maybe I'm in a too pessimistic place right now overall. So this, I'm just thinking back to 2008 in Georgia, South Ossetian context. There was essentially, there was activities in 1990s, then there was a big drop in activities in early 2000s. There was almost no cooperation, even on civil society level in 2000. Then you had the 2008 war, and then suddenly you had everybody invested in Georgian South Ossetian peace building, and like there were a lot of funding coming from European Union, and American diplomacy was invested, and so on and so forth. So a few years after it all died down, and you know, didn't go really anywhere constructive since then. So I'm somewhat assessing it as a similar, as in there is a lot of, I'm invited at least to 2 talks like this every week, at least 2. So I turn down now about 80% of them just because I physically don't have the time. Like in prior to the war, maybe 2-3 a year invitations were coming along, right? So there is much more interest from everybody. Suddenly Karabakh was in the news. So I connected more with that. It's just suddenly a lot of international attention, which will die down in a month or 2. So sorry, but that's one area where I don't see this to be necessarily sustainable and self-generated, let's say, approach. Second point is that, yes, you have more positivity, not more positivity, but more outreach from Azerbaijan or Azerbaijani experts. So you see much more So if this was the area, yeah, the site rather until the war that was much harder to speak for peace from, right? So in Azerbaijan, it was much more taboo, let's say. You had very few people from Azerbaijan who were willing to talk about peace. Now that Azerbaijan won the war, that's much more acceptable. The consequences for speaking in favor of peace are much lower. So there are many more people coming forward who I don't doubt that had the same ideas prior to it. I don't think they suddenly became pro-peace, but now there is a political opening to talk. And then you have the opposite situation in Armenia, where if at least at least conceptually talking about peace was not forbidden until now it is. So now talking about cooperation or peace is actually becoming dangerous in Armenia or for Armenians. So, you simply have, I think, a change of direction, where it's acceptable, where it's not, based on who lost the war, who won the war. So this is again, the pessimistic assessment. Having said that, I think it's a simply necessity to build on what we have. And yes, there are a lot of platforms that are appearing. There are a lot of individuals and academics and practitioners and policymakers engaging with each other to a level that we have not seen since 1990s, essentially. So I think, yes, it's absolutely very important for people like you and me and to keep this movement going and not let it die out once the international interest does. So yes, I'm supportive of what you said. I think even though I'm pessimistic analytically, in terms of intentions, I'm very much supportive of what you said. I'm sorry, Jakub asked the question that I wanted to answer again, and I'm more pessimistic. And unfortunately, there were very few. So Imagine, because Imagine is one of the maybe 3 or 4 NGOs that has been around in the last 10 years. There were many more in the past, interestingly, when there was less civil society in place. So even that was more like a 1 or 2 or 3 for a showcase. There's so much an NGO, right, can do on its own. There's so much activities can do. You need really the entire civil society to work in that direction. So this is where my argument is, that we didn't have any kind of comprehensive approach. And partially it was because, of all these internal problems I mentioned, such as heavy investment into ethno-nationalist education and so on. But partially it's connected also with funding schemes, for example, that very, very heavily privileging. And that's common, by the way, not only in this conflict, but in all the NGO funding world, that almost all the funding goes into DC, London, Brussels-based kind of this corporate massive NGOs that come in and implement some small project on leave. And there are some fantastic people in these NGOs, right? So I don't have a problem with individuals working in these British or European NGOs, but essentially that's where all the funding goes. With even those who want to do some work getting a very, very small chance to do anything on the ground, while you see millions going towards peace building. What really reaches the ground can be like 20, 30,000, and millions disappearing somewhere else, right? So this has been another problem of why even those who wanted to get into peace building couldn't necessarily find resources to do the work. And that, I hope, will change. The European Union recently enacted a new initiative that is, continuation of older ones in a way, but it has been restructured to put much heavier emphasis on involving local actors. So that was an important reassessment of their approach, and I'm hoping that trend will continue.
Thank you. I actually wanted to comment and ask a question about some of the things that are brought up in the conversation with Leila and Philip. There are certain things, the Soviet thing that we always talked about, the nationalities policy and various things. But there's something they're hiding in plain sight, which often gets lost in the discussion, particularly to do with the post-Soviet space. Kind of exceptionalism develops in how we talk about it. So apart from the fact that that era, when the Westphalian state notion starts to come in, and Soviet Union is not any different from any other place which is trying to construct that. So that process which happened in Soviet Union regarding minorities, ethnicities, nationalities, ideas of borders within, that happened globally at that time. I mean, of course, some earlier, some later, and so on, and how the nation state was born. And with it was born the minority, with it was born the hierarchy of titular nations and the languages and flags and everything else. So it's and juxtaposed on that is that same kind of a moment, the withdrawal of empires, creation of nation states, and then the next step of that, how the colonial legacy ends. So, and the freedom is acquired, which almost requires you to otherize, and the conflict seeds in many places, most places. I mean, that we see Azerbaijan and Armenia and other things happening in Caucasus. Again, South Asia, the same thing happens. Empire withdraws and goes into conflict. We still are in it. And there are certain underlying causes which are a result of that particular process. But we kind of not engage with that. We think of very specific thing that the Soviet communists did this, and this led to this, and this must be always brought up in the Western context. And it's kind of like beginning of every paper on any part of the Soviet space, without the fuller context. So it's not saying that it wasn't a problem. It's not saying that something bad was done, but it's about what actually happened in an analytical sense. So that was one point I wanted to kind of put back onto the table, because if we don't understand that, if we don't understand the process of otherization, then we cannot, and in that particular context, not in some general generic context, made up in UN or some other body, we won't make progress. And that's linked to the second thing, which you just commented very, very, very much in detail about the NGO funding and so on. Again, looking at civil society actors which are pre-manufactured on different value systems and mechanisms of engagement and mitigation, which which have particular values and norms being parachuted into different places. Yeah. So kind of many societies, particularly in Asia and the post-Soviet Asia, I would say, where the traditional or historic forms of mitigation, working together, including managing tensions, not killing tensions. Tensions will always be there. How do you manage them? So they get lost or become very romanticized, even if they're brought in. And we see that happening in Caucasus much more so, within the post-Soviet space. And the final point within that is that I can't help compare to Central Asia, which I know better. There's a very specific sense in Caucasus to bring in foreign actors. There's always somebody you want to call it mediation from outside, going somewhere to talk about it, while Central Asia wants to always internalize, bilateralize, and not ever be brought into an international agenda if there's any disagreement. So very different practices coming from the similar starting points. These are some things which I thought we often kind of leave out, and I wondered if you had considered them, or I'm just missing them in my discussions.
Well, that's really interesting comment, particularly the last one. But if I briefly start from the first comment and then go through the others. So completely agree with you. It's just time is limited. I didn't want to go all the way to Westphalia. Otherwise, absolutely in agreement that there was nothing unique in institutional sense of what Soviet Union did. If anything, if there was any uniqueness, it wasn't there in a positive sense, in my view. So a lot of this was done with an intention to solve the conflict. So I don't believe that the intention was to create conflicts. That was the consequence, not necessarily, in my view, at least the intention. Of creating autonomies and so on. I think it was initial policy, at least, was more progressive, trying to kind of emancipate the smaller groups who have been traditionally suppressed. And then, it ended up as it ended up, and we have a very typical post-colonial problem. So the current problem, if you look more globally, right, is very similar to many other post-colonial conflicts where there is a contestation of borders and identities and so on. Agree with that. The linking it to the second question, though, is that the NGO funding and parachuting values in. I'm Western educated primarily, and I teach in the West, so it's hard to say I'm one of those probably who parachutes ideas in.
So am I.
So right, so a lot of us, yeah, of course, we are in Cambridge forum and so on. So that's so I come from, of course, a brainwash perspective myself, I guess. Having said that, I think we are past the stage in many areas where there is anything traditional really remains, right? So at least in South Caucasus, that might be different with Central Asia. At least in South Caucasus, it's been long enough part of either Ottoman Empire or Russian Empire, or the EU integration process, yeah, this liberal democratization process, and so on, that I don't, if you have any tradition, you have to go back to Hobsbawm, right, and the invention of tradition. All the traditions were pretty much also, based, they had some basis, of course, the culinary and art had some basis. I don't say they come from nothing, but in the sense of being institutionalized as Armenian or Azerbaijani cuisine, or Armenian Azerbaijani music, or Armenian Azerbaijani folklore, and so on. They were pretty much all also done by the Ministry of Culture or Ministry of Education of Soviet Armenia, Soviet Azerbaijan, right? So, which is again in a very much Westphalian tradition of this mix of civic, of ethnic nationalism, and so on. So in that sense, I don't see much space necessarily for any kind of genuine local tradition of conflict resolution or existence of it. At least I'm not aware of it in this particular region. It has its specificity. But it might be different in Central Asia, which I think maybe was less integrated into these nationalist movements of late 19th century, let's say, that South Caucasus was. So that's the first caveat. So I don't necessarily believe in it, that the traditional mechanisms exist as such. Second part is that then what do we do with this? And I don't necessarily think that that's the westernized education was a problem. If it was a problem, it was a problem earlier, when nationalism was introduced, when the Westphalian world division was introduced, but that already happened. So now we are in a post-Westphalian, not post-Westphalian, Westphalian still, but post-colonial space, where the countries have been built on a blueprint of Westphalia and neoliberalism and everything like that, as specifically as post-colonial ones. So then, in my view, you go to the mechanisms within that system that work. Yeah, and there I see very little choice but to look into relative success cases, for better or worse, yeah, post-World War II in Europe. And you see a very massive investment into, right, yes, nationalism is in place, but the meaning of nationalism changes. It becomes much more inclusive, and you still have a very intentional ongoing effort. 70, 80 years past World War II, Germany and France still have student exchanges, because there are still very serious ethnic stereotypes in place, right? There is still now very intentional work being continued to, yes, keep the nationalism in place, but in some less violent format, channeling nationalism towards soccer games, right, as opposed to football, I guess, in British version, English, as opposed to wars, right? So this is where I think, since we are in that space right now, yes, maybe we can think about alternatives, about some post-Westphalian world, but when we are in Westphalian world, we need to use the Westphalian mechanisms for solution, which we don't necessarily do there. So I don't see a problem with parachuting in the ideas anymore, since that's the world we live in. I see a problem of not letting the parachuted ideas to grow, because we bring in the idea of liberal democracy, but then there is no institutional support or financial support, right? So you introduce an idea of liberal peace, but then you don't develop, you don't do any liberal peace, like you don't do judicial justice, you don't do economic integration, and so on and so forth. So I think, since that's where we are, we simply need to take it with logical conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, again, the question, same, we have to keep taking things apart, like what does liberal mean? And again, we can look at India and other countries where you have so-called full-fledged democracy, but it hasn't prevented our conflict at all our borders and so on. In fact, that it almost seems to feed the liberal democracy.
Absolutely, but, and that's my argument. Is I'm sorry, but
yeah, sure. Yeah.
In Georgia and Ukraine, you have much harsher version of fascism developing compared to Russia and Azerbaijan, for example, because they are more democratic. Because in Russia and Azerbaijan, this very fascist trend is actually suppressed by the authoritarian regime. So the democracy doesn't correlate necessarily. Yes, it's selfish. Please. No.
Are there further questions? It's getting, I think, dinner time for many people here and sleeping time for many people in the region. But Philip, I would say that you were going to comment on the third bit earlier regarding that how the lack of internationalization of regional issues in Central Asia versus very prominent approach in.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah, no, that's interesting, and I'm not as familiar with Central Asia as South Caucasus, but I do connect that to the way these nations developed as nations, as in states, which is in the South Caucasus case was following the late 19th century, right, kind of period of decolonization and self-determination and kind of this very kind of European blueprint of nation building. And from there on, the relationship were always developed as mediated through some regional or global power. So there was always an appeal to UK or to Britain at the time, to Russia, to somebody, Turkey, and so on, to kind of side with you against your neighbor. Because again, they always saw themselves as part of this bigger European game. As nations, they developed into, as nations, they see themselves as part of that network and play by these rules. With Central Asia, I think, has a very different process of nation building. I mean, similar to the extent when it comes to the Soviet nationalist policy, of course, but different in terms of absence of integration or following this kind of European blueprint. So that may be one area, and then Central Asia might have preserved more of local traditions for relationship building, and maybe I'm assuming here that overall the West is a bigger outsider a bit than it is in the South Caucasus in that sense, and bringing that in is not necessarily.
Yeah, I think the last point is what I mean, there's no silver bullet, but I think the last point actually plays a major role in that. Who wants their hand in there?
As in internationally, who wants their hand in there?
Yeah. I mean, how does the mediating forces work? So I mean, we don't have any. I don't think there is any real studies on the fact that who wanted to mediate in a particular case and how they were accepted or rejected.
You mean Central Asia? Central Asia, right?
Yeah. So we don't fully know, but it just that's what it looks like, and it could be misleading. Yeah. So I just wanted to. There were a couple of questions put in the chat, and I realized that they were not put to everyone. And these are not, I think. Let me see. So, I'm sorry, I'm very bad at this reading small print. But broadly speaking, there was a point made that how, as you mentioned earlier on about the technicality regarding the prisoners of war issue, that the combatants were, or rather, sorry, the prisoners were not combatants. It was after ceasefire had been signed, and that would technically legally be true in that way. And another point related was made that regarding the Armenia side not sharing the mining maps. Is there any information on that, or I mean, if you could like to say something further?
No, I don't have any information on the first one. Yes, agreed. Yes, these are mostly people captured, at least to the extent of what is known publicly. These are people who were captured after the cessation of hostilities, and this is where the technicality comes in. That there was no war, so it's not prisoners of war. But the question is, what is war, of course, and still, why do you hold people if there is no war, right? So there. So I still anyway. That's a whole.
Sure. No, understood.
We discussed. On the second question, sorry, can you remind me?
About non-sharing of mining.
Mining map. So that's frankly an information. Again, something vice versa. From if the first one is an issue big in Armenian media, this is an issue big in Azerbaijani media. So I haven't seen much discussion of it in the internationally or in to Armenian sources. But I know from the past that this VR region, the line of contact, previous line of contact was very heavily mined, starting from early 90s. And there has been a lot of, so I think unfortunately, this issue is also politicized in two ways. On one hand, yes, probably Armenia has more information about these mines and presumably is not providing. Again, we don't know. I don't know this was the extent of the cooperation there or not, whether it's part of negotiation or what. But I have a second question. I don't know how much maps Armenia has. So it probably has more recent ones. And the reason is that Armenia was trying to demine these territories for 30 years. It had a very, that's why I'm not sure how much information they actually have.
The issue of competency, almost.
No, it's not competency on the issue. It's not clear who mined when and so on. I think it was because the war of 1990s was not a type of organized war that we had in 2020. Mm-hmm. There were not necessarily standing centralized armies. A lot of it was done in a very grassroots level by volunteers. Mm-hmm. Because of that, for 30 years, these territories were not, even the territories controlled by Armenian side, that they intended to demine, they couldn't. They had a major support from international community for 30 years from Hala Trust to demine, and they couldn't, well, they did to an extent, but they never finished the work. So I'm pretty confident that, yes, Armenia certainly has maps of the more recent mines, but there are a lot of mines put in place earlier that probably nobody really has any kind of comprehensive sense of, and that's a whole other problem. And that's in turn being politicized, by both sides, both for negotiation purposes and for propaganda. So unfortunately, there are a number of complicated problems to be dealt with, including the mining.
Sure. Thank you. No, that we've covered a wide, properly academic stuff and very, in the news things. And if anybody has a last question, this is your chance to raise your hand, open your mic, start speaking. If not, which doesn't seem to be happening, I'll hand over to Jakub, and I'll thank Philip, and I hope that this is not our last conversation. I certainly don't think it will be. I think there's plenty for us to discuss in future and see how we can build our our own capacity about the region by talking to you. Jakub, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saxena, and the biggest thank you of today belongs to Philip, Dr. Gamaghelyan. I think this is the discussion and the content of the debate was what I think we were hoping for, and both on from many senses, Montu said, from the academic sense, but also from the practical sense of what can work or cannot work in the region. So this is so again, a big thank you, and I really hope again to continue with the conversation. And I have many more questions that I will probably ask you over a beer in Bratislava if you come. So hope to continue in the discussion, and also, as Montu said, possible cooperation as well. And big thank you to the audience who came today and for the interesting questions and debate.
Yeah, and lastly, I would say the Zoom talk is basically a rain check on you being here with us when it's allowed to be so. So we hope to see you in Cambridge as well. Yeah. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I would like to say goodbye for now. Further on, we will going to have further both presentations and events. We will, of course, be informed through the mailing list. But I'll give you a sneak preview that one of the speakers going to be, the next speaker in the series is likely to be Professor Alikberov from Moscow, who recently has just been elected as head of Oriental Studies Institute for the Russian Academy of Sciences. But he actually comes from the region himself, so his view will be particularly interesting to hear. And I hope the rest of you will be able to join us. but time and date for that to come. Look out for Jakub's emails. Bye for now. I will leave. Bye.
Have a good day, Philip, and a good evening and good night to everybody else. Bye-bye.